Hello, and welcome to class lecture 5 of our spring 2024 critical thinking and problem solving course. Here's our agenda. We'll cover chapter 3. We'll get through part of chapter 5. We're going to cover a big part of the course in chapter 5. It covers fallacies and persuaders. We'll get through about half of the fallacies that we want to discuss tonight, and you'll understand more what fallacies are when we get to that point in the lecture tonight. But we'll finish the fallacies next week, and we'll get into the persuaders then. As you recall, you're going to have a quiz this week. 10 multiple choice questions, 2 essay questions. I'll discuss more about that quiz at the end of today's lecture. There is an assignment that I'm giving you, but recall that you do not have an assignment due for next week. You'll have an assignment due for 2 weeks from now on April 22nd. I'm only including the assignment with this week's lecture in case you get finished with the quiz and you submit it and you want to get started on the assignment. You can go ahead and do that, but you certainly don't have to submit the assignment until April 22nd, 2 weeks from today. I'm recording this on April 8th, Monday, April 8th. And of course, after that, we'll adjourn for the lecture. Chapter 3 is on making sense of arguments. Let's start with some argument basics. The author of your text, Lewis Vaughan, tells us that the point of devising an argument is to try to show that a statement or claim is worthy of acceptance. The point of evaluating an argument is to see whether the task has been successful, whether the argument shows that the statement or conclusion is really worthy of acceptance. Vaughan goes on to say that arguments come in 2 forms, deductive and inductive. A deductive argument is intended to provide logically conclusive support for its conclusion. An inductive argument is intended to provide probable but not conclusive support for its conclusion. The next few slides will provide more information about deductive and inductive arguments. So, when a person makes a deductive argument, the argument could be said to be either valid or invalid. What we mean by a valid deductive argument is one that succeeds in providing decisive logical support. On the other hand, it is said to be invalid if the argument fails to provide such support. Both of these are valid deductive arguments because they succeed in providing decisive logical support. Recall from our earlier lectures that arguments are comprised of premises and conclusions. Premises are statements or reasons given in support of the conclusion of arguments. The conclusion is a statement that the premises are intended to support. Both of these are invalid deductive arguments because their conclusions do not logically follow the premises. Now we'll take a closer look at inductive arguments. While we classify deductive arguments as either valid or invalid, we classify inductive arguments as either strong or weak. An inductive argument that succeeds in providing probable but not conclusive logical support for its conclusion is said to be strong. One that fails to provide such support is said to be weak. Both of these arguments are considered strong inductive arguments because they provide probable but not conclusive logical support for their conclusion. However, notice that while both provide non-conclusive logical support for their conclusion, only the first argument is entirely true. It is very important then to know that it is possible for a premise in a strong inductive argument to be false, but logically sound at the same time. So while the second example above is one of a strong inductive argument, it cannot be said to be a good inductive argument. This can be true of deductive arguments too. One can create a valid deductive argument with a false premise, but it would also not be a good argument. Good arguments, whether deductive or inductive, must have true premises. A deductively valid argument that has true premises is said to be sound. Note, too, that while we can have a valid argument with false premises, it is impossible to have a deductively true premise with a false conclusion. Speaking of premises and conclusions, before we cover our next topic, I want to remind you that we can identify premises and conclusions by recognizing indicator words. We covered indicator words before, but the next few slides exhibit some premise and conclusion indicator words. To identify premises, we can use what are known as indicator words. Some of the more common premise indicator words appear on this slide, and there are even more listed in the textbook. I'll leave the slide up for a second or two so that you can read the indicator words. Similarly, we can identify the conclusion in arguments by the presence of conclusion indicator words. Here are some of the common ones, and as with premise indicators, more are listed in your text. Now I'd like to jump over to Chapter 5, Fallacies and Persuaders. As I've mentioned before, I believe this chapter to be perhaps the most immediately valuable chapter in the book because it demonstrates the way some folks use what are called fallacies and persuaders, often in underhanded ways to convince us to vote in a certain way, buy certain products, and accept other points an individual is making. Now we'll look at two types of faulty arguments, fallacies and persuaders. I just mentioned that folks who are perhaps a bit less than honest may knowingly use fallacies and persuaders in unethical ways. But I also need to point out that some folks with good intentions may also use these means simply because they didn't have the requisite critical thinking skills to craft a rational argument. So it's not always somebody trying to do something evil. A fallacy, according to Louis Vaughan, is an argument that is both common and defective, a recurring mistake in reasoning. A persuader is a rhetorical move that uses such devices as innuendo, euphemism, dysphemism, stereotyping, ridicule, and rhetorical definition. And we're going to go through all these, so don't worry about the terminology at this point. Tonight we'll cover about half of the fallacies I'd like you to be familiar with. Next week we'll conclude with the remaining fallacies and move into persuaders. A fallacy that is the result of an irrelevant premise has no bearing on the truth of a conclusion. Some of these types of fallacies that we'll investigate in this lecture and next week include the genetic fallacy, fallacy of composition, the fallacy of division, and several others. A fallacy resulting from unacceptable premises are relevant to the argument's conclusion, but have no bearing on the truth of the conclusion. Examples of this type we'll look at include the fallacy of the false dilemma and the fallacy of the slippery slope. This slide and the next show all of the fallacies that we'll cover. There are YouTube videos to accompany the information provided in the following slides. The video links appear on the slides. You may stop the lecture video to link to watch a video before continuing to the next slide in the lecture video, or you may watch the entire lecture presentation, then go back and watch all of the videos on one after another. The genetic fallacy occurs when one claims something is true or false because of its origin. This fallacy most often refers to non-human abstract origins. As an example, an alternate energy plan is dismissed because it's the brainchild of a liberal think tank in Washington. An example of the fallacy of composition occurred during the John F. Kennedy presidential administration. His closest hand-picked advisors were considered the best and the brightest. Most were educated at Ivy League schools and had significant policy experience. In a nutshell, Kennedy's advisors encouraged him to send a number of Cuban expatriates back to Cuba to gather up enough Cubans to overthrow the Castro government. However, the plan failed miserably in spite of the advice of the best and the brightest. The video linked to this slide has another example of the fallacy of composition. The fallacy of division occurs when one advances the idea that what is true of the whole must be true of its parts. This is the opposite of the fallacy of composition. An example of this occurred when the great Michael Jordan was still playing basketball for the Chicago Bulls. In one particular game, Jordan scored 48 points. At the end of the game, sports writers crammed into the Bulls locker room to try to get an interview with Jordan. One writer near the back of the room realized he'd have a long wait to interview Jordan, but he noticed a rookie player who had gotten into the game late and scored the first 2 points of his pro career. The writer asked the rookie what he remembered about the game. The rookie thought for a minute, then said, "I'll remember this game as the one in which Michael Jordan and I teamed up to score 50 points." That's a pretty obvious example. The young man scored only 2 points, but he, through the fallacy of division, is saying that because 2 of us scored 50 points, I must be responsible for as many points as the other person, or a good portion of those 50 points. This slide has a link to another example. The ad hominem fallacy occurs when one attacks the individual making the argument rather than the argument itself. The fallacy of equivocation occurs when one uses a word in 2 different senses in an argument. The video link to this slide is a pretty obvious example. Here's a tip to avoid a negative situation. When constructing an argument, be as precise as possible to avoid misunderstanding. When evaluating another's argument, if there is any confusion about how a word is used in the argument, get clarification. The fallacy of appeal to popularity occurs when one argues a claim must be true because a substantial number of people believe it. When I was a young kid, all the mothers in my neighborhood fell prey to the fallacy of appeal to popularity. If my buddies and I played outside on a hot summer day, our mothers wouldn't let us drink anything cold right away after coming inside. All the moms had this belief that drinking something cold when overheated could cause some sort of stroke or something. Another common belief when I was a child was to put butter on a burn to ease the pain. As it turns out, putting butter on a burn is actually bad for the injury, as the skin beneath continues to be hot rather than cooling down with something like water or ice. In the video link to this slide, you'll hear the narrator distinguish between content validity and logical validity. To remind you of examples we've looked at in this lecture, an argument can be logically valid while at the same time lacking content validity. Vaughan gives the following example of the fallacy of appeal to tradition. Acupuncture has been used for 1,000 years in China, therefore it must work. Note that this is an example where the conclusion may be true, but cannot be based on the premise provided. So this is one of those examples where the conclusion, while probably true, is based on a faulty premise. So this is not an example of a good argument. The video link to this slide is based on a very famous short story by the author Shirley Jackson. This is probably the longest video you'll watch in this lecture, but it is the best example of how an appeal to tradition may have dire consequences. The fallacy of appeal to ignorance occurs when one's argument is based on a lack of evidence proves something. So, for instance, if one claims they believe in ghosts and you challenge that belief, they may come back with, "Prove me wrong." In other words, you are now expected to show proof that ghosts do not exist. However, as the narrator in the video link to this slide points out, the burden of proof is always on the person making the claim in an argument. As promised, there is no discussion item due this week. I'm including the next discussion topic due on April 22nd now only because some of you might want to get an early start on the assignment once you've submitted your completed quiz. Here is your assignment for 2 weeks from now. You'll use the discussion area of our Class iLearn page to submit your answers. You must submit before Monday, April 22nd at 11:59 p.m. Central Time. You are getting 2 weeks to complete this assignment because of the quiz you'll be submitting. So just to go over the assignment, choose any 4 fallacies from the list that appears in this lecture video. I think we covered 10 of them, so pick 4 out of the 10. Find an example for each of your chosen 5 fallacies. You can use things like newspapers, TV news, ads, either in magazines or on the internet, commercials. Some of those are some of the best places to find examples of fallacies. Analyze the argument being made. Identify the explicit or implied conclusion. Did you recognize any conclusion indicators? If so, what were they? Next, identify the premises. Did you recognize any premise indicators? If so, what were they? Construct the argument for each of the examples. For each example you have, identify the fallacy. Post your answers to the discussion section in iLearn. And remember, this is not due until April 22nd, 2024 at 11:59 p.m. Central Time, but you can get started on it anytime you feel like it. As you know, it's time for a quiz. Let's talk about the quiz now. The quiz consists of 10 multiple choice questions and 2 short answer essay questions covering earlier material in the lectures. Only lectures 1 through 4. No items from this lecture will be on the quiz. If you score between 9 and 12 correct answers on the quiz, you will receive a grade of A. 8 correct is a B, 7 correct is C, 6 correct is a D, and 5 or fewer is a failing grade. You must complete and return your quiz to me by Monday, April 22nd at 11:59 p.m. Central Time. Do not open the quiz until you are ready to take it. Class dismissed. As always, please don't hesitate to contact me if you have issues with the videos or the quiz form. Have a good week.